Well, hey, let's talk about determining the structure of the sermon in line with the literary form or the genre of the passage that you've landed on. I'm drawing my thoughts here in these moments from this book, Preaching in the Literary Forms of the Bible by Thomas Long. This is a great resource, another one to add to your library if you're looking for more resources for your future. There's also some great thoughts in Edwards' book on page 82. You know, sermons will look different based on the literary form of the biblical text. You have Psalms and Proverbs and narrative passages that you would preach differently than if you were preaching out of an epistle. An important note, God inspired human writers to choose the precise language he wanted to use to communicate his purposes. And God inspired human writers to choose the precise literary genre, the style, the arrangement of the words, the type, the kind he wanted to communicate with. God inspired a combination of word and genre to communicate his ideas. So we must understand words plus genre, the style of the writing. So for example, psalms and poetry, songs, they're not designed or written to make 3 points from. If you're reading a section utilizing Hebrew poetry, like in the Psalms, we remember that the rhythm of Hebrew poetry is repetition and parallelism, saying something similar in multiple ways, giving us more ways to grasp the meaning of what's being said. So a sermon on a psalm would be more creative, more personal, more artistic, perhaps a topical sermon on prayer and worship, with gold nuggets to be explored in the psalm. Similar with Proverbs. A whole sermon might be just on a couple of verses of Proverbs. And then you have narrative stories. The sermon really is the narrative itself. And so you might tell the story or even reenact it. Remembering that the key components of a good story, with twists and turns and surprises and turning points, point to a then that draw some applications. I mean, think about it. What makes for a good story? And how do you recognize a really good book? Well, consider this about narratives, a story. You know, a story draws you in as characters are developed. And then there's twists and turns in the story, and you're drawn into the plot, and then something creates tension. Tension is created maybe by a trauma, a bad guy shows up, something unsettling happens, and the narrative is structured around a plot conflict that needs to be resolved. And then there's emotional involvement in the story. Narratives touch the heart. And then there's linguistic artistry, that narratives are written with literary skill, abstract ideas presented in tangible form, and application deals with ideas in real life, and it's believable. Kind of like the parables of Jesus. He was a genius in teaching parables, stories, and he used word pictures that come through with visual pictures in story form that have a really important point. So if you're teaching on a parable or a story, here's another great resource, Telling Stories to Touch the Heart by Grant and Reed. Really good resource. I'd like to draw some thoughts from this book also, The Homiletical Plot. The Homiletical Plot by Lowry. He gives another way to look at how to preach narratives and the important structure of narratives. First, there's this upsetting the equilibrium. He calls it like, oops, it's a crisis. Something happens to unsettle the story. And then examining that discrepancy, the ugh. I mean, what's going on? Describe the tension that is arising there. Help people to feel that the ugh, oh, this has to be resolved. And then disclosing a clue to the resolution, like, aha, maybe this will work. And then as he forms it from a gospel story, experience the gospel, that this is yippee, this is awesome, it's getting resolved. Experience the joy of that, the gospel, the good news. And then anticipating the consequences. Yay, there's resolution, hope, joy, good prevails, the good guys win, wonderful epilogue. So for example, the story of Exodus 1 and 2, and the story of Moses, Pharaoh ordered the killing of babies. Oops, tension, crisis. Hundreds of babies are thrown into the Nile. And then Moses is born to a Levite couple, named later Amram and Jochebed. They try to hide the baby. I mean, what would that feel like? Hiding a baby when there's already been hundreds of babies thrown into the Nile. Describing that situation, describing the tension. Ugh. I mean, you could even add some drama into this story as you're telling it, if you're preaching it or teaching it. I mean, how do you hide a crying baby? And every time there's a knock on the door, is that the soldiers? You can be sure there was a lot of prayer happening. God, give us wisdom. Give us a plan to save this Moses. And then the mom of Moses, along with the help of Miriam, they float Moses out into the Nile, full of crocodiles and dead babies. Ugh, ugh. But they had planned this all out. Pharaoh's daughter rescued Moses from the Nile River, and the sister of Moses, Miriam, made sure the plan all worked out. Aha! The baby Moses ends up back in the arms of his mom to be nursed, and Pharaoh's daughter pays child support. What a story. Yippee! And Moses is saved and launched to becoming the leader of the people. Yeah. So maybe the topic of that story would be how faith conquers fear. The subject question might be, how do we conquer fear with faith? And the complement could be, we can conquer fear by faith by following the example of Miriam and her mom. We can learn strategies for conquering fear with faith. And then coming up with some applications to that. Make a basket, cover it with the tar and pitch of faith and prayer, and then float it out there and see what God does. So with a passage like Exodus 1 and 2, there's wisdom in being true to the genre, to the style of the writing. That is a story, it's a narrative, and not just pulling out three main points. So form is important to consider as you think about putting your sermon together down the road. Be true to the genre, even as you study it. Don't try to do a verse-by-verse exegesis of a narrative or a psalm. But you sure can do that with epistles and sections of the Gospels, particularly where Jesus is teaching, like in the Sermon on the Mount. So you can focus on the principles of story, whatever your sermon, and just consider the different literary types and context of the Psalms, Proverbs, narratives, New Testament epistles, and Gospels. Hope that's helpful for you.